I knew something was wrong before my son said a word, because my old blue coffee mug was gone. It had sat in the same corner of the cabinet over the sink for so many years, my hand still went there without looking. Eleanor bought that mug at a church rummage sale in 1998 because she said the color looked like the last clean piece of sky after a storm. The handle had a hairline crack near the top, and the glaze was worn dull where my thumb always rested. I reached in that Sunday morning and found a lighter mug in its place. White, thinner. Easier to hold, I supposed, if somebody had already decided your hands weren't what they used to be. I stood there with the cabinet door open longer than I needed to, looking at that mug, like it had answered a question I hadn't asked yet. The kitchen still smelled like percolated coffee and the onion I'd sliced for the potato salad. Outside there was March mud in the side yard and the sound of a truck downshifting on Maple Street. Sunday lunch at my house had been a fixed point for years. Eleanor used to say if family couldn't manage a church pew and a sandwich once a week, then civilization was further gone than the newspapers let on. Even after she died, I kept it up. Rye bread, deli ham pickles in the cut glass bowl her aunt left us coffee before and after. Daniel and Claire came most weeks. Sometimes my sister Linda did too if her arthritis wasn't acting up. I took the white mug down anyway. It felt wrong in my hand. Too light, like something from a hospital room. Claire came in through the mudroom while I was standing there, her heels clicking once on the old linoleum before she remembered where she was and softened her step. She carried one of those paper bakery boxes under her arm and had her purse over one shoulder and her phone in the same hand. She always looked put together even at church potlucks, like she'd been ironed before leaving the house. "Oh, good," she said when she saw the mug. "You found the new one." I looked at her. The new one. She set the bakery box on the counter and smoothed her hand across the top of it. Daniel said that blue one was heavy. "This one's easier on your wrist." My wrist was fine. I nearly said it, but the words stayed where they were. Claire had that way of talking where objection arrived too late. By the time you opened your mouth, she'd already placed the matter under a heading called settled. "I liked the old one," I said. She smiled, but not at me exactly. More in my direction. "This one's better for every day." Then she crossed to the table and slid my wife's salt shaker out of the center and replaced it with a neat stack of folded papers under the church bulletin from First Baptist. There was a pen laid across the top. That was the second thing. I set the mug down and asked, "What's all that?" "Oh, nothing urgent." She didn't look up. "Just some things Daniel wanted to go over while everyone's here." Everyone. As if my dining room had become a meeting hall and I was waiting for the board to arrive. I dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle and watched her fuss with the paper edges until they lined up with the grain of the table. That table still carried a burn mark from when Daniel was 14 and set down a soldering iron without thinking. Eleanor had thrown a dish towel over it and shouted his full name so loud the dog barked. Then later, after he went upstairs embarrassed, she rubbed the mark with mayonnaise because some woman at church swore it pulled heat from wood. It didn't, of course. The mark stayed. So did Daniel's shame. He ran his finger over it once or twice in the years after, whenever he was waiting on dinner. That morning he came in through the front door without knocking, calling Dad like I might not be 10 feet away in my own house. "In here," I said. He stepped into the kitchen carrying cold air and the smell of his aftershave. 44 years old and built broader than me now, though not in the same way. Softer in the middle. He wore a quarter-zip sweater and the expression men put on when they have already had a conversation in the car and agreed who will say what. He kissed Claire on the cheek, then looked at the papers. "Good." That one word settled on me harder than it should have. "You're early," I said. "Thought we'd help get things ready." He took the coffee pot off the burner and tipped it toward my mug before I could reach for it. "You want me to pour?" "Ooh." I held out my hand for the pot. "I've still got the hang of it." He laughed like I'd made a little joke and handed it over. "Just offering." We moved around each other in the kitchen with the politeness people use in funeral homes. That was another thing I hadn't learned to like since Eleanor died, how often grief turned a room formal. Folks talked softer around me for about 6 months after the burial, then they got used to her being gone and found other ways to lower their voices. Claire opened her bakery box and showed me a coffee cake dusted with powdered sugar. I thought this would be nice. Less work for you. I already made lunch. I know, this is just extra. The word extra can sound generous or corrective. In that kitchen, it sounded like corrective. Linda arrived 10 minutes later in her tan coat with the missing button and a foil pan of baked beans balanced in both hands. She stood in the doorway, stomping mud off her shoes, and said, "Lord, it's a mess out there," and for a second I felt the day loosen toward normal. Linda still looked at me the way she always had as her older brother, and not a project. We sat down around noon. Ham potato salad, baked beans, pickles, coffee cake, untouched to one side. The house was warm enough that the windows had gone a little cloudy at the corners. Claire had opened the blinds over the sink and weak sun came across the floor in stripes. Daniel waited until plates were fixed and the first few bites were taken. Then he dabbed his mouth with his napkin and said, "Dad, before we get too far, there are a few things we need to settle." Nobody moved much after that. You could hear the old refrigerator kick on. I set my sandwich down, settle. Just practical matters. He leaned forward and tapped the papers with 2 fingers. House stuff, accounts, making things easier. Claire gave a small nod, like a nurse confirming medication. "So you don't have to keep carrying everything by yourself." I wasn't aware I was carrying anything I couldn't manage. Daniel exhaled through his nose. Not a sigh, exactly. Nobody's saying that. It was the kind of sentence that usually means somebody is saying precisely that. Linda looked from him to me and back again. "What sort of things?" Daniel answered her, but he kept his eyes on the papers. "Just future planning, streamlining. In case Dad wants less on his plate," I said. "My plate seems to be handling a ham sandwich all right." Linda gave a little breath that might have become a laugh on another day, but Claire spoke right over it. "It's not about today, Hal. It's just about making sure there's structure in place." Structure. Another word that sounds innocent until it lands in your house. Daniel slid the top page toward me. My full name sat across the top in black print. There were yellow tabs along the side marking signature lines. Not notes, not talking points. Places to sign. I didn't touch it. "What exactly did you bring into my house?" I asked. Daniel rested both forearms on the table the way he used to when he wanted to sound reasonable as a teenager. "Dad, don't make this bigger than it is." Bigger than it is. I looked at the tabs again, then at the pen Claire had laid so neatly across the stack. Linda said softly, "Hal ought to read whatever it is first." "Of course," Claire said. "That's all this is." But Daniel had already begun explaining, and the way he did it tightened something low in my chest. He talked about consolidating accounts, protecting the property, reducing stress, avoiding confusion later on. Every few sentences he said for Dad, the way men say for the customer in auto shops when they have already decided what part they're replacing. I asked one question about my checking account. My checking account, the same one my pension hit every month, and Daniel answered it himself before Claire could. "He doesn't need the whole picture right now," he said almost to her. "Not to me. We can simplify it." The room got very still around that sentence. I don't know whether Linda looked at me then or whether I only felt her do it. What I know is that something in me shifted. Not broke yet. Shifted, like an old floorboard taking weight. I picked up my coffee, tasted it, and found it already lukewarm in that thin white mug. After another minute, I stood and said I was getting the coffee pot. Nobody offered to stop me. Nobody asked if I was all right. Claire only reached across and straightened the stack of papers again while Daniel kept talking in that steady voice about options protection process. I carried the pot to the kitchen and paused just beyond the doorway, where the wall cut their voices in half if you stood one way and sharpened them if you stood another. Claire said quietly, "Do you think he even understands what he's signing?" I stood there with the coffee pot in my hand and let the silence stretch one beat too long. Then I set the pot down on the counter as carefully as if the noise of it might give me away. Claire's voice came again lower this time. "I'm serious, Daniel." "He understands enough," Daniel said. "He just gets stuck in the weeds." That one landed harder than the first. Stuck in the weeds. Like I was some old tractor sunk to the axle behind the barn. I don't think I breathed right for a second or two. The kitchen window over the sink showed my reflection faint and gray in the glass coffee pot behind me. Dish towel hanging crooked from the oven handle, the white mug still sitting on the table out there where I could see its rim through the doorway. It struck me then how much of getting old is being expected to ignore what you plainly hear. Claire said, "Then don't push too fast. We don't have the luxury of dragging this out." His voice had that clipped edge it got when he was trying not to sound irritated. If he changes his mind next month, or starts talking to somebody, or gets some idea about selling, then we're back in the same mess. Somebody. Selling, same mess. I heard a chair move, maybe. Linda shifting in her seat, maybe Claire sitting back. Daniel lowered his voice further, but not enough. Once the house is locked down, it's done. There are sentences a man hears that keep making their way through him long after the sound stops. That was one of them. Not because of the house. Not even because of the money behind it, though I could hear that too, now plain as rain on gutters. It was the way he said it. Locked down, like the place his mother and I had built over 38 years was a matter of timing and signatures and getting ahead of an old man before he drifted somewhere inconvenient. I took my phone from my pocket and touched the screen with my thumb. My hands were steady. That almost upset me more than if they'd shaken. I started the recording and left it face down on the counter beside the bread box. Claire said Linda's in there. She won't do anything. That one had a smaller sound to it, but it cut cleaner. I listened another few seconds, enough to catch Claire saying, "Then at least slow down the way you talk to him," and Daniel answering, "If I slow down, he'll start asking questions." I picked up the coffee pot again and walked back to the table. Nobody looked startled. That was the strange part. They had already decided I was harmless enough to speak around. Daniel was slicing his fork through the potato salad. Claire had both hands folded near the papers. Linda was watching the tablecloth pattern like she might find a safe place to stand in it. I poured coffee into Linda's cup first, then my own. Daniel started to talk again, but I said, "Give me a minute." He stopped. I sat down and looked at the top page. Durable power of attorney, temporary management language, property oversight. Words designed to sound practical until you remembered whose house it was and whose name sat at the top. Mine. "I didn't ask for any of this," I said. Daniel leaned back like a man keeping his patience with weather. "You shouldn't have to ask. That's the point." Linda cleared her throat softly. "Maybe Hal ought to have some time with it." "He's had time," Daniel said. I looked up. When? He gave me that look children start using on their parents in middle age, halfway between concern and annoyance. "We've talked about this." "No," I said. "You've raised pieces of it. That isn't the same thing." Claire stepped in before he could answer. "Hal, nobody's trying to corner you." The papers were tabbed. The pen was laid across them. They had arrived early. "Nobody was trying to corner me." I glanced toward the cabinet where the blue mug should have been. I could not stop thinking about that stupid mug. The replacement had not happened by accident. Claire had not wandered into my kitchen and thought, "Today's the day I improve Harold's ceramics." It had been chosen. Not because of arthritis, because it fit the story better. Better for every day. Easier to hold. A small adjustment made in advance for the man they needed me to become. I thought then of another small thing from 3 weeks earlier. Daniel had been over to help me clear the gutters. We were in the garage afterwards, standing beside the old freezer drinking bottled water because the day had turned warm too early. He'd asked casual as anything whether I'd ever thought about downsizing, said a place this size could become too much if something happened. I told him nothing had happened except Ohio weather and leaf buildup. He laughed and said he was just thinking ahead. 2 Sundays before that, Claire had reorganized the drawer by the phone and tossed out a stack of receipts I hadn't gone through. She said they were clutter. One of them was from the jeweler where I had Eleanor's wedding band, resized the year our 10th anniversary trip got cancelled because Daniel had pneumonia. I'd kept it because she liked that trip even without the trip. Said marriage was mostly 2 people learning to bless disappointment without making a shrine of it. I had almost told Claire to leave the drawer alone that day. Almost, but she had looked so efficient and so certain she was helping, and I had thought, what I always thought, don't be difficult, Hal. Don't be the old man everybody has to work around. That was the lie I'd been living inside. Not that my son loved me. I knew he did in his way. The lie was that if I stayed measured enough, grateful enough, none of this would harden into something real. Daniel pushed the papers a little closer. This protects you. From what? He hesitated, but only a little. from stress, from mistakes, from people taking advantage. The nerve of that nearly made me laugh. I stood up again, and this time nobody said a word. I carried my cup to the hallway table where the house phone used to sit before Eleanor got tired of telemarketers and shoved it into the den. My cell was in my pocket. I stepped into the den and closed the door almost all the way, leaving it open enough that I could still hear the low hum of voices at the table. Margaret Bell answered on the second ring. Bell. Margaret, it's Hal Mercer. Her voice changed at once. Not softer, just more focused. Hal, is everything all right? I looked through the gap in the door. Daniel's head was bent toward Linda, now his hand open over the papers as if he were explaining taxes to a child. Claire had her chin tipped down in that composed way of hers. I've got my son and daughter-in-law at my table with transfer papers, I said. They told your office I was ready to move forward on something I never agreed to. There was a small pause. Then Margaret said, I wondered when this might happen. Those 6 words did something to the room inside me. I sat down in Eleanor's old wing chair, the one with the worn arm where she used to rub hand lotion in winter. What do you mean? I mean, your wife was not careless, Hal. My eyes went to the bookshelf across from me. Eleanor's bird guides were still there, the red cardinal bookmark sticking out of one because she never did finish that page the last winter she was alive. She had been weaker by then, but her mind stayed sharp enough to make me tired, just keeping up with it. Margaret lowered her voice. The last time she came in, she was very clear. She said grief makes decent men vulnerable to people who mistake sadness for softness. For a second, I could not answer. I heard the refrigerator kick on in the kitchen, heard Daniel laugh once at something too low to make out, heard my own blood in my ears. She said that she did, and she wanted the house protected before anything could be framed as help. I looked down at my hand, resting on the chair arm. Eleanor used to cover that hand with both of hers whenever she thought I was pretending not to know something painful. Not to comfort me exactly. More to say, don't insult both of us by playing dumb. I had played dumb after she died. Not with bills, not with meals, not with the furnace filter or the snow blower or the roof over the mudroom. I had played dumb about my son, about the little shifts in tone, about the way he started saying things like for now and going forward whenever the house came up, about Claire moving through rooms she did not own with the confidence of somebody already drafting the next arrangement. Margaret, I said, and my throat felt rough on her name. Did she think Daniel would do this? She thought someone might. She hoped she was wrong. That cost me more than I expected. Not because Eleanor had doubted him, because she had doubted him enough to act, and I had gone on believing patience would keep everybody honest. Margaret said, listen carefully. Do not sign anything. Put me on speaker if you need to, and Hal, yes, the trust is already in place. They cannot do what they think they can do. I closed my eyes once. Not long, just enough to steady myself against the strange mix of relief and shame moving through me. Relief that Eleanor had seen further than I had. Shame that she'd needed to. All right, I said. When I stepped back into the dining room, nobody looked up right away. That told me more than if they had. Daniel was speaking with that same patient tone. And once the account structure is cleaned up, it'll be a lot simpler for him day to day. For him, I took my seat. Claire slid the pen a fraction closer. Daniel looked at me then and gave a small nod like we were nearing the reasonable end of something. You all right? I looked at my son's face. I could still see pieces of the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from Little League cleats on dirt on his knees, his mother laughing because he could sleep through stoplights and train horns both. I could still see him at 14 burning my table with that soldering iron and crying harder over the damage than the scolding. I could still see him at 27 carrying boxes into this very house after his first apartment lease fell through, embarrassed and grateful and careful with the walls. And there he was now across from me with tabs on papers and timing in his voice. I said, I'm listening. He mistook that for surrender. I saw it happen. He rested his hand flat on the document. Good. Because, Dad, the truth is, you're too worn out to fight us on this. And this time I didn't swallow it. I set my cup down beside the plate and said, that's enough. Nobody moved at first. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside a dog barked twice and quit. Claire's hand stayed on the pen. Daniel kept his palm on the papers like he could hold the whole thing steady by force of posture alone. Then he gave a short breath through his nose. "Dad, don't do that." "Do what? Turn this into some kind of scene." I looked at him for a moment. "You came into my house with legal papers under a church bulletin and told me I was too worn out to fight you. I don't believe I'm the one making a scene." Linda's eyes lifted from the table. It was the first time all afternoon she'd looked straight at Daniel without flinching. Claire leaned in a little. "Hal, nobody's against you here." That was the sentence that finally did it. Not because it was the cruelest, because it was polished, finished, meant to slide over everything that had already been said like a fresh coat of paint over water damage. I reached into my shirt pocket, took out my phone and laid it on the table beside the stack of papers. Not hard, just flat and deliberate. Daniel's eyes dropped to it. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means, before anybody explains what's best for me," again, I think we ought to hear what was said when you thought I wasn't listening. The room changed then, not loudly, it just lost its balance. Claire sat back first. Daniel didn't move, but his fingers lifted off the papers one at a time. Linda made a sound in her throat, not quite a gasp, more like a body bracing for weather. "Dad," Daniel said, and there was a warning in it now. "I wouldn't." "I know you wouldn't." I touched the screen. For a second, there was only the hollow kitchen sound of the recording picking up the room. Then Claire's voice came through smaller and flatter than it had in the doorway. "I'm serious, Daniel." Then his. "He understands enough. He just gets stuck in the weeds." Nobody at the table breathed right after that. I watched Daniel hear himself. It's a strange thing seeing another person meet his own voice without anywhere to put it. The recording kept going. We don't have the luxury of dragging this out. If he changes his mind next month, or starts talking to somebody, or gets some idea about selling, then we're back in the same mess. Once the house is locked down, it's done. Claire shut her eyes once. Daniel's face had gone still in the way some men's faces do when panic is trying to pass for irritation. Linda had one hand pressed flat over the tablecloth. I let the next part play too. "She won't do anything. If I slow down, he'll start asking questions." I stopped it there. No one said a word. I looked at my son. "You were right about one thing. I was asking questions." Daniel recovered first, or tried to. He sat up straighter and pointed at the phone like it was the problem in the room. "That's out of context." "Is it?" "Yes." His voice sharpened. "You overheard half a conversation and recorded it like I'm some kind of criminal." "No," I said. "I recorded it because you brought papers into my house and talked about me like I'd already handed you the keys." Claire found her voice, then soft and urgent. "Hal, you have to understand how stressed Daniel has been. He's trying to protect what matters." I turned to her. "What matters to who?" Her mouth parted, then closed again. Daniel shoved back his chair half an inch. "This is exactly why we were trying to simplify things. You get dug in and emotional." I leaned forward before he finished. Not much. Just enough that he had to stop and meet my eyes. "Don't do that," I said. He blinked. "Do what?" "Use the word emotional. When what you mean is, I disagree with you." That landed. Linda looked down quickly, but I saw the corner of her mouth tighten. Daniel tried another angle. "Dad, you've had a hard couple of years. Nobody blames you for that. But since Mom died, you've been alone in this house and what?" He hesitated. I said, "Finish it." Claire jumped in again. "He means you shouldn't have to carry all this by yourself." "No," I said. "He means you've both been waiting for grief to do your work for you." That one hit the center of the table and stayed there. Daniel stood up. "That's not fair. Neither is walking into your father's dining room with signature tabs already in place." He looked at Linda, then maybe for help, maybe for an ally, but she was done being furniture. She folded her hands in her lap and said very quietly, "You told me this was just future planning." "It is." She glanced at the phone. It didn't sound like that. His jaw worked once. "Aunt Linda, please." "No," she said, and there was more strength in it than I'd heard from her in years. "No, Daniel. Not please. Not after that." Claire reached for the papers, maybe to stack them, maybe to make them disappear, but I put my hand over the top sheet first. "You leave those." She pulled her hand back like she'd touched a hot pan. I picked up my phone again and tapped another button. There's one more person who ought to hear the rest of this. Then I hit speaker. Margaret Bell answered on the first ring. "Hal, I'm here," I said. "You're on speaker with Daniel, Claire, and Linda." "All right." Daniel stared at the phone. "You called Margaret." "I did," Claire said. "Why would you involve an attorney in a family conversation?" Margaret answered before I could. "Because it stopped being a family conversation when transfer documents were prepared in advance and presented under coercive conditions." Daniel flushed dark under the skin. "This is ridiculous." Margaret's voice stayed calm as a courthouse wall. "No, Mr. Mercer. Ridiculous is assuming your father's age and grief amount to consent." He opened his mouth, but nothing came. I sat back and let her speak. That was part of the satisfaction, I won't lie. Not because I wanted him humiliated for sport, because he had walked into the room so certain he was the adult in charge of it. Margaret said, "For clarity, Harold Mercer is under no legal obligation to sign anything you have placed before him today. Further, the property in question is already protected under a trust structure your mother and father established before Eleanor Mercer's death. Any attempt to pressure or misrepresent his intentions regarding control of the house would be viewed very seriously." Daniel stared at me. What trust? There it was. Not concern, not confusion about my wishes. Just naked alarm that the thing he wanted wasn't where he thought he'd left it. I almost pitied him then. "Almost. Your mother came to see Margaret before she died," I said. My voice surprised me. It was steadier than I felt. "She told her grief makes decent men vulnerable to people who mistake sadness for softness." Claire's face changed at that. She looked down. Daniel gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Mom thought I'd steal from you." I shook my head. "Your mother hoped she was wrong." He looked like I'd struck him. That was the cost of it. Not the phone call, not the papers, that line. Because it belonged to Eleanor, and once I said it out loud, there was no putting our family back inside the version I'd been protecting. Daniel dragged a hand over his mouth. "Dad, I'm in a bind." There it was, at last, small and ugly and human. Not love, not principle. A bind. "I know," I said. He stared. "You know." "I know enough. I know this wasn't about helping me balance a checkbook. I know you didn't come here worried about my wrist. I know you thought if you dressed this up in concern I'd be too lonely or too tired to call it what it was." Claire whispered. "We were trying to keep things from getting worse." "For you," I said. She looked at me then, and for the first time all day there was no polish in her face. Just fear and shame and a kind of hard self-defense, still not ready to die. Margaret spoke once more from the phone. "Hal, would you like me to come by tomorrow and bring copies of everything for your records?" "Yes," I said. "Very well." After I ended the call, nobody moved for a few seconds. Then Daniel reached for the papers. This time I let him take them. He stacked them sloppily, not caring about neat corners anymore. Linda stood first. "I think I'll go." Claire rose with her purse already in hand. Daniel stayed where he was. Another moment, looking around the room as if he'd misplaced something in it besides his plan. When he finally looked at me, I saw not the boy from Little League or the young man with boxes in his arms. I saw my son as he was, frightened, proud, ashamed, and still trying not to feel the full weight of what he'd done. He said I was trying to fix it. I nodded once, at my expense. He didn't deny it. That was how I knew the talking was over. They left by the mudroom. Claire first, then Linda, with her foil pan tucked under one arm and her eyes wet. Daniel lingered long enough to put his hand on the doorknob and say without turning around, "I never thought you'd do something like this." I looked at his back and answered him with the cleanest truth I had. "You mistook my grief for weakness. That was your mistake, not mine." Then he went out. The house made a different kind of quiet after they were gone. Not empty exactly. Emptiness has a drift to it. This was stillness after pressure. The sort you get when a storm passes close enough to shake the windows but keeps moving. I cleared the table slowly. Ham wrapped back into wax paper, pickles into the icebox. Claire's coffee cake stayed untouched in its box. I put Eleanor's salt shaker back in the middle where it belonged. Then I went to the cabinet over the sink, reached past the white mug, and found my old blue one shoved behind a stack of bowls. I stood there, holding it longer than made sense. By dusk, I was out on the back porch with Eleanor's flannel blanket over my knees. The yard was soft with March thaw, and the maple along the fence line had that dark, wet look trunks get before spring decides whether it means business. Somewhere down the block, a screen door slapped. Then a radio started up in somebody's garage, low and tinny. Behind me, the house settled into itself. One board ticked in the hall. The refrigerator turned on. Familiar sounds, house sounds. For 2 years after Eleanor died, every one of them had carried the hollow of her absence. That evening they sounded different. Not full, not healed, but defended. I sat there until the light thinned out of the yard, and the blue mug cooled between my hands. For the first time since she died, the silence behind me did not feel like something waiting to be taken. It felt like mine.